From Vermont Public, this is The Frequency. I'm Brittany Patterson. It's Monday, February 24th, National Trading Card Day. Shout out to my Magic the Gathering playing husband. Here are today's headlines. The University of Vermont Health Network announced Friday that it will continue to run 3 dialysis clinics around the state. The health network unveiled sweeping cuts to services in November after regulators decided to limit how much revenue the hospital could take in. The cuts included stopping operations of dialysis clinics in Rutland, Newport, and St. Albans. The health network, in a press release, said it had been unable to find any other organizations to run the clinics, and that on Friday, regulators voted to allow the hospital to take in revenue from the clinics. According to the hospital, they'll still lose money running the dialysis clinics and are searching for ways to decrease costs. A Shelburne cop who fatally struck a cyclist with his cruiser is now facing criminal charges related to the incident. Sergeant Kyle Kapitanaski was cited late last week on a charge of grossly negligent operation with death resulting. The crash occurred November 11th around 2:45 a.m. on Shelburne Road in South Burlington. Kapitanaski was on duty at the time and driving south when Vermont State Police say he hit Sean Hayes. Kapitanaski is due to be arraigned on the charge in March. He faces up to 15 years in prison and a $15,000 fine if convicted. A new poll shows a majority of Vermonters disapprove of President Donald Trump's job performance. The poll was conducted by the University of New Hampshire Survey Center and used responses collected online from just under 950 Vermonters. Overall, just under 1/3 of residents approve of Trump's job performance. But when broken down by party, the numbers looked much different. 86% of Republicans thought the 47th president was doing a good job. 18% of independents approved of Trump's job performance, while less than 1% of Democrats agreed. Rich Clark is a political science professor at Castleton University.
Our views are really solidified by party. It was the case where you can predict most responses based on partisanship.
The poll also showed that many Vermonters oppose executive orders issued early on by the president. Abenaki leaders from Odanak First Nation were at the Statehouse last week, calling on Vermont legislators to reconsider the state recognition process, which they say legitimized 4 groups who are not Abenaki. This is the first time Odanak leaders, who are based in Quebec, were able to bring their case directly to lawmakers in Vermont. The state lies within the nation's unceded territory. Jacques Watzeau is an elected official with Odanak. He says he was representing 4,000 members from 2 Abenaki First Nations.
We are not here to blame the legislator of Vermont. You were not wrong, rather you were misled. Individuals and groups without legitimacy have manipulated history, told falsehood, and taken advantage of the lack of rigorous verification to obtain recognition that does not belong to them.
Members of state-recognized tribes interrupted the presentation several times. The 4 Vermont groups have repeatedly denied allegations of identity fraud. And the Mount Washington Avalanche Center is asking Vermont skiers to share reports of snow conditions as part of an effort to make backcountry skiing safer in the region. The Avalanche Center issues daily avalanche forecasts for New Hampshire's presidential range, but no such forecasts exist for Vermont right now. Jeff Fonjimi leads the Avalanche Center. He says if there's a lot of interest in the Green Mountains, they could someday hire staff to issue formal forecasts here.
We've known that people are skiing an avalanche terrain in Vermont. We know skiers triggering, getting caught and carried in avalanches in Vermont.
Fonjimi says reporting signs of avalanche danger can help keep other skiers safe, but people should always make decisions based on what they see around them. You can report conditions online at mountwashingtonavalanchecenter.org. Coming up, how can researchers be good stewards of Indigenous data? A new study from Dartmouth offers some suggestions. That's after this.
Thanks for listening to The Frequency, where support comes from VITA, supporting business growth and innovation in the Green Mountain State. From agriculture to manufacturing, energy to food production, find solutions that turn your business dreams into reality. Visit VEDA.org and see how VITA can help make it happen.
Environmental scientists are gathering new data about our planet every day. It's often sampled or collected from land stewarded by Indigenous people. And a new study out of Dartmouth College examines how current research practices can improve the governance of Indigenous data. That can include data about Indigenous ecosystems, health, cultural practices, and language. Assistant Professor of Environmental Studies at Dartmouth, Lydia Jennings, is a citizen of the Pascawa Yaqui tribe and was the lead author of this study. She spoke with NHPR's Julia Fudakawa about her work and began by talking about how Indigenous data related to other kinds of environmental data.
Indigenous data, I think, really pertains to the environmental ecosystems and really helping to inform us about stewardship practices, about place based names. So, for example, I drive around New Hampshire. I'm new here, I'm from Arizona, and I see all of these creeks named Indian Creek. And I'm curious, who are the Indians they're speaking to? Why would Indigenous people gather here that might be attributed to why this is called Indian Creek, right? We're missing a lot of the core pieces in the metadata of why this place is named that. So that's just one example I observe on a regular basis. But when we think about as an environmental scientist and how we are collecting information, whether it's about soils or plants or marine organisms, and how often in metadata you'll see that Indigenous people use this, but it's really disconnected from the people itself and from their own governance practices. And so when we think about Indigenous data sovereignty and how we can govern this data, it helps give us more information of the people who have stewarded that data that help us have better grounded science.
So as I was reading through your paper, something stuck out to me immediately. It was right in the introduction. It's a sentence that says Indigenous data often remain unrecognized or marginalized within contemporary discussions of environmental data. Why are Indigenous data often pushed to the side?
I mean, for a long time, people didn't think Indigenous people were scientists, right? Um, so that's part of it. We are still having a lot of jurisdictional challenges in being able to access our homelands, and that can transcend into the digital realm. I see a lot of the conversations about Indigenous data sovereignty thinking about how do we apply Indigenous people's rights from the physical ecosystems into the digital ecosystems. So that's a big piece of this. The other part is, I think, understanding how to steward Indigenous data by non-Indigenous people is something that people are afraid to make mistakes on. And this is part of why we wrote this paper, is to really give environmental scientists who I think want to work well with local tribal nations and environmental stewards in a way that is appreciated, that is equitable, but often just don't know where to begin and are afraid of making the wrong step. And especially as we get into more and more of the data science and the larger pieces. So this is part of why we wrote this paper as well as another paper, really giving tools and guidelines and recommendations for scientists on how to begin and how to steward this data long term.
Yeah, let's touch on a few more of those. What are some of the recommendations that you give in your study?
We give a range of recommendations that go from really basic pieces of how do we think about the assessment and communication with local communities. How are we providing training to scientists on cultural awareness? How do we access sites and build up protocols with people with local communities? How do we develop acknowledgments and review site names that might be harmful? Recognize past relationships with scientists who might have been harmful. How do we think about the data and specimen management? And increase visibility of traditional stewards in an area, especially on public facing material. And then how do we engage data hosts on Indigenous metadata, support education, across earth sciences, and really engage in ethical attribution and reuse through data policies. So many of these recommendations we recognize are going to take a while to happen, but it's the process of beginning a generational change in science.
With that generational change, can you speak more to the collective benefit for all of us of incorporating Indigenous data into pre existing data structures? What do we learn? What do we gain?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest piece is that by learning from the local experts of an ecosystem. So, in my area, my community, our tribe has been there for 400 years, right? Thinking about all of the environmental expertise that we've had in this area as we've encountered multiple climate changes and how our communities have shifted help give us more information about how to be responsive to current changes. And I think about how this is magnified across many Indigenous communities globally. And so being able to understand Indigenous data sovereignty and the rights to govern that data, but also makes people more engaged in wanting to be part of science projects. It means that we have more truth grounded science moving forward. It means that we don't spend as much money repeating the experiments that the local Indigenous people could tell you the answers to, right? So I think it really makes sure that science funding is better spent. It makes sure that people are more included in the process, and it makes science a safer practice.
How do we make sure credit is given where it is due?
In my papers, often uh, we include our local tribes and scientists involved in that process as authorship, but also if they don't want to be authorship, that's up to their discretion as well. And then I think it's again recognizing how Indigenous peoples are helping to inform the practice, and making sure that's well done. The other part, which again comes to this environmental data governance piece, is really ensuring that in our databases, we're attributing whose Indigenous homelands are we collecting samples on. If this data gets reshared and reused, how ensuring that the future scientists are also connecting with those communities to let them know these projects are being done, and getting permission from that process. So all of those are important pieces to ensure that communities are both cited, but also informed in the process, which historically just has not happened.
Well, Lydia, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was NHPR's Julia Furukawa speaking to Lydia Jennings, an assistant professor of environmental studies at Dartmouth. Thanks for listening to The Frequency today. We had original reporting from Liam Elder Connors, Lexi Krupp, and Abigail Giles. Our executive producer is Kevin Trevelyan, and our music is by Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Brittany Patterson. We'll be back in your podcast feed tomorrow.